Hallo, seien Sie herzlich
Hello and welcome back. We will now start the next part of our Congress and invite you to that. And we will talk about questions that have been addressed before in the panel as well, about the precarity of arts and critique. And we're talking about sites and economies of critique. Economical usability of critique is very important, and the public area is a part of that. Who gets a voice in the public? This is a question that is connected with the question of who gets, for whom. How is relevance being lost, and how can we oppose that? I will now welcome here María Inés Plaza Lazo, who I know from other contexts already. She is part of the AICA, and thank you very much for contributing to this concept of the Congress. She was born in Ecuador, and she just distributed her newspaper Us of the Working Class, which is which describes her work, which is a multilingual newspaper for poor people and on art. So it addresses just everybody, and it is about everything. Whoever sells it earns something and earns the full price of it. She has had a radio feature with Art and Bundeskunsthalle, where she talked about decolonization, the radio, and we have now had a change in the panel. I am looking forward to welcome Zoe Claire Miller here. She is the spokesperson of the BBK Berlin, and she replaced somebody who is sick. So thank you very much for joining us on short notice. The floor is yours.
So, schönen guten Tag.
Hello, and thanks to everybody who joined us after this lunch break and who will be here on the 5th day of the Congress. I will have to change the slides, and I would like to know if that works from here.
Okay, wie auch immer.
All right, whatever. So, it is a sense of gratitude that fills me to be able to moderate this roundtable on these important topologies and typologies. Sites and economies of critique. This feeling is at the same time shaped by a deep impatience, skepticism even, and about how effective institutions like the Akademie der Künste and the Bundeszentrale can be consolidating the response that critics, members of the ADK, so the Akademie der Künste, and fellow panelists and audience members might be. Perhaps it's also a sense of powerlessness, of how little synchronicity there is between the space, like this one, the digital space, and the urges on the streets due to increasing wealth deprivation. For the past week, a debate has been burning over the guidelines for funding grants through Neustadt Kultur in the Visual Arts Division. The funding procedure was unequal, and one of my panelists will probably correct me here. artists in project rooms have to show exactly what they spend. This is not the same with galleries, which, as journalist Fabian Rüdiger was told and reported on the program in Dreisat, talked about sweet money, that is money that was not closely controlled. One would think that all these questions should also concern the German Cultural Council and its managing director, Olaf Zimmermann, who, however, described on Twitter the research aired on Dreisat and done by Deutschlandfunk Kultur and the BBK Berlin as a mirage. Interesting, wouldn't you say? Artists who criticize Neustadt Kultur for these opacities, not only artists but also workers in art, as well as journalists who find one embarrassing loophole after another, are degraded by Zimmermann as illusory. I ask myself, and I hope this is a question that can be answered later by the audience and take up the responsibility of the audience after this roundtable that we've already had. How and when is criticism taken seriously? And second question, what is the price of critics? And why wasn't there even any pursuit of funding for critics in the first Corona years? What didn't the German Association of Art Critics, the AICA, do? What did the Förderverein der Deutschen Galerien under Christian Jamuschek did? Why, people in my newsfeed ask, do things work much more transparently in the arts than in other fields? Because all organizations and associations in the arts work for political influence. That is even the mission of the BBK Berlin and the Academy of Arts. But how intransparent can these processes become with reference to the working conditions and conditions of the cultural enterprise? The affiliation to different sectors is, among other things, what unites and separates us in this panel. So, Zoe Claire-Miller, Rüdiger Suchsland, and Martin Schüttler. Originally, this panel was intended as a joint analysis of working conditions for the emergence and reward of criticism in public media, education, and academic circles. Rüdiger speaks from the perspective of film production and criticism. Martin represents artistic and organizational work through experimental music. And, well, usually Sabine Scholl was supposed to come here and tell us about the academic work at universities. But Sabine would have normally been here, but her son is sick, and thankfully Zoe Claire-Miller has stepped in. This panel will therefore mediate between film, music, and art criticism, and will also therefore be devoted to their publications and alternative channels. As self-contained bubbles of criticism against each other, they barely touch. In the future, aka right now, however, these fields must work more closely together if we are to feel responsible, after all, for a public sphere in which private and public exchange ideas on equal footing. As a prelude to this two-part symposium that the collective and platform new models are rightfully and visually mapped, we as critics find ourselves in the midst of the implosion of old or legacy media and the decentralization of information through social media. This decentralization does not just mean a redistribution of attention that renegotiates the role of critics and further separates them from art production and the networks of legitimacy within the art market and institutions. I think that might have been unclear, but we will talk about this later. Value creation is more tangible than ever. What does that mean? This shift, this decay of the press has profoundly changed the way we establish our attention and financial stability as cultural workers. Secondary income, non-specialist jobs, and administrative work formed from new structures. Those accompany the profession of the critic. Arts of the working class also emerged from exactly this situation, which I just distributed outside, and you can find it outside in the lounge next to the stairs. It is on sports and handicap. But I will talk also about the publication founded by Paul Sohaki and myself as a tool for the crystallization of power structures between the questions, maybe. How this atomization of media turns critics into hyphenates, so into people who work in several professions at the same time, is something that we see clearly on this podium today. Zoe Claire Miller is an artist and co-founder of the Alternative Berlin Art Prize, founded in 2013, and was a spokesperson of the Coalition of the Free Scene. She has been on the board of BBK Berlin since 2016, and spokesperson has been its spokesperson. Martin Schüttler is a composer and co-initiator of the platform for contemporary music, Stock 11. He was invited to teach composition at the Darmstadt summer courses in 2012 and 2014. Since the winter semester of 2014 and 15, he is professor for composition at the State University of Music and Performing Arts in Stuttgart. Last but not least, Rüdiger Suchsland is a journalist, film critic and director. Amongst others, he has worked as a writer for the FAZ, Filmdienst, Telepolis, Deutschlandfunk, Die Welt, Frankfurter Rundschau, Berliner Zeitung, Jüdische Allgemeine, and the Rolling Stone. Since 1997, he has been an editor at Arteshock. And with this small introduction, I will start with the first question to the plenary. And I hope that we will have a fruitful exchange, and I hope I'm not asking for very limited things, but I hope that my questions will start a critical debate. The media have become holographic, so that means they only copy information from other sources which do not represent a perspective anymore. The contents are not linear anymore. The manipulation is real. Where do you stand, or where do we stand as art critics or cultural critics? Who wants to start? Well, I'll maybe try. Oh, no, you wanted to. Well, maybe I will start because I'm not a critic, well, at least not officially. I'm really happy that I could step in here and wanted to say EBK Berlin and BBK itself, and this is always confused. So, and I was called the spokesperson of the Bundesverband Bildende Künste. So, but I'm actually spokesperson of the Berufsverband Bildende Künste Berlin, which is very important when it comes to federal funding as well. And I am not a critic, so I'm going to try to not respond to your question as very much, so much, because the others might have to say more. So you heard John Miller and Julieta Aranda said at the beginning of today's program, they started that with the saying that everybody can be an art critic. And how do you see yourself in also in your capacity of the spokesperson of the BBK Berlin, not only on social media? So this reminds me of Boys, that everybody can be an art critic. It points at one of the most important tasks of art to make people think, to make people question things and form their own opinions. So also to publish on a platform where everybody can see that and each individual can make themselves a critic nowadays. The differentiation of my role as a spokesperson of the BBK Berlin, where my task is to represent the interests of the artists, and my private criticism is that in this official capacity, I am a lot more careful. But if I act as myself, an individual, a critical activist, I, of course, can say that everything that I want to criticize privately, even if I also have to assume another role as well. Well, I hope that we will get back to this question later. Rüdiger, maybe it's your turn. So we can talk a lot about definition, if everybody can be a critic. But to get back on this, if everybody is a critic, I would like to contradict that, to oppose that. Because, well, of course, it's important that everybody can utter their opinion in the public discourse, but to be able to be a critic, you need experience and expertise. You don't have to define this expertise, but it has to be clear. It has to be expressed in some kind of opinion, also by the critics. You want to answer to that? Well, you make me think. So film and film critique, they belong together, at least since Carrière du Cinéma. What is better for film critic is the deep understanding or distance? Well, both, of course. It is always the same thing with those questions. The interesting thing is that in Germany, even before the Carrière du Cinéma, people like, for example, Lotte Eisner, who is a film curator as well, and came to the set from Fritz Lang in Weimar and Berlin, and there was no limit, there was no distance. But at the same time, the distance is very good because you have to write about the film, and if you are friends with somebody, of course, it is very hard to be objective and to write objectively on this topic. Well, of course, you can never completely make sure that this is the case, but you know that critics are artists often themselves as well. But and you also know that criticism is an art as well. But it is the case that we have to say that you would lie if you would take everything out, your person, your opinions and everything you think. This should be expressed in criticism, and if a critique includes those, then it is a qualitatively good critique. I have to say, well, of course, it doesn't mean that I have to say very flatly, I don't like a certain director, or I can also say that some types of film, of course, I prefer to others. In Carrière du Cinéma, you can learn a lot. You can learn that these borders can be transgressed. Those people have, of course, learned a lot. They weren't only critic, but they were also directors. And Godard said, the best critic of a film is another film. And so the best critic of a critique is another critique. So this stays very clear, and you have to make the positions clear. And transparency is a new German word for this thing that sounds quite abstract and analytical, but it is very important. And I would always say for myself, if I am friends with a director, of course I would write about those films, and who reads my texts knows that I'm friends with a person. Of course, I wouldn't write it down, I'm friends with that person or that director. But if I think that a film is bad, I wouldn't write about it. You don't have to include all of the personal things in your critique. Well, maybe we should make transparency more concrete. Martin, it's your turn. Well, can you hear me? Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy I'm here, and I'm absolutely delighted to see an interdisciplinary panel here with so many different perspectives, and I would want to reflect on that, because it is very important if you differentiate between those critiques and the locations or sites of critique and the economies of critique. All of those fields that appear very transversal do have their very specific sites and traditions. And therefore, I would like to say that those sites are not innocent, but they very much coin the critique or criticism. I'm not a critic, so Zoe, you're not the only one. And I think it's very important to underline that I come from the perspective, or speak from the perspective of contemporary music and experimental music. And here there is another basic problem. It doesn't exist in critique. So, of course, this is an hyperbole, but I can say that it has lost its sites and is only connected to historical formats. And this does not always do justice by that. At the same time, to say about the different intersections and the connection of these different earning or income situations, if you talk about contemporary music, it has been the rule for decades that there is almost no single profession. There is only interest conflicts and intersections, and this is also due to the very small scene, so everybody has to take up many roles at the same time, because it's a very small circle of people. What are the sites and economies of critics in this field of experimental music? Well, in this case, it is especially free newspapers, free journals, special ones that are funded autonomously and have tried to stay autonomous and are not connected to big institutions. And there is also the counterpart, so the public radio stations that also carry sound bodies. For example, the SWR is still also investing a lot of work in the contemporary music, and many of those radio stations have stopped their work on this.
With us as working class, we see the street as the place of critique, which is why I brought Paul Satsky to send me a series of pictures that he does when it comes to the distribution of street newspapers, as well as 10, I think, pickup stations for the salespeople and those who pick it up for free. And now, perfect, thank you. Okay, I think you have to turn around a little bit. Okay, so while Zoe is fixing the problem, another question for you. Now, if the place of critique is the street, everyone could claim to do good critique. That doesn't matter, you can come back. I'm sorry, yeah, humans and technology, sometimes, it's a little bit problematic. So Zoe, as an artist, you very often play the role of critic when it comes to structural questions of funding or working conditions. Now, what is the exchange between critique or critics and those creating art and culture, so that it's not just 1% of those creating art will receive funding? Did you mean worthy of critique or worthy of funding? That 1% of those creating culture are worthy of critique? You mean that they receive that much attention, that they are being reviewed, or that they receive critique? No, let me formulate it differently. So 1% kind of zoomed out of society. Well, I would agree that not everyone is a critic who expresses a critique. And, I think that, the lyrical and literary experience is, part of, not necessarily part of good critique. I don't know if it's Deutschlandfunk Kultur. When I read, these very, very bad critiques of performative arts, in opera, classical music, or theater, we also have to say that, it's a form of art. And then I ask myself, why doesn't it exist for visual arts? So then negative criticism are usually very, it's just not expressed very harshly and just mentioned in a short sentence at the end. And I think the reason is that in visual arts, there is such a strong economic dependency from those clients that buy ads, that are the market, institutions, gallery, etc. And I know some of my friends who are critics, they are paid very, very poorly. And so, the question of belonging to a class and, being able to access this profession, what kind of critical perspectives are missing if no one coming from the working class, for instance, decides to exercise this profession? But those that choose to become a professional critic, and they can, rely on the fact that apart from their jobs for newspapers, they still have to take on other jobs on behalf of galleries, for instance. So, they write text, for instance, that are then published in catalogs, or, for instance, press texts or media texts for exhibitions. And within visual arts, there are very strict hierarchies that are also very intransparent, and there is only a small blue chip percentage in that area where it's really about a lot of money and where we see a lot of attention being directed at. And a lot of people creating art and work in that area are really, working or living off a minimum, living off very, very little money. And that's, of course, very problematic. And I think I would wish for it to be different, because it would be a lot better for the art scene if there were more independent critics who also are paid in order to really take a long time to do research and to take a long time for their critique, for their review, and so that they don't think, okay, I have that many lines that I need to write and I get 50 euros, and then ask themselves what they can actually write in that text, and also don't have to fear negative consequences, so that they are they're not being censored by, for instance, the media that they're writing for, because some of the marketing or some of the ad clients might be pissed off if something negative is being written about them. So I think that's very interesting because from my point of view, I can also use it for my own example because, when you talk about the very little time that they have for research and for background information, of course that is due to the little money that is being paid, but also because of the attention economy that it is being integrated into. If everything has to happen very, very quickly, for instance, yesterday we talked about content versus form, which I think, I thought the keynote speech yesterday dealing with that was very, very, very good literary contribution. But of course, due to all of that, we see a feeling of irrelevance for this type of preciseness and this kind of, of this critical critique that is then transmitted to the public sphere, maybe not for book publications. But, if things have to happen very, very quickly, it of course also then is moving downwards in a bit of a spiral kind of movement. Now, let's go back to the question of how much time do people have for their critique, and what about music, art, and film critique or reviews? Is that only something that, the middle class can afford to do? And doesn't that mean that we ignore by default that it would actually have to be structured differently, not just based on class consciousness? Doesn't that mean that we undermine the conditions, the working conditions, or the funding? But what are the goals, or where do people end up after, after studying 5 or 6 years in Germany, fortunately, without any fees? And sometimes people have to work 3 jobs and pay a lot of money for a very small room in Munich, and then have the possibility to study in Munich, study art history in Munich. But the question of what a sustainable economy is something that we didn't really talk about during my studies. And when I finished and I graduated, I asked myself, what did I do for the last 6 years? I was very shocked. So now the question for you, maybe very explicitly in your case, Rüdiger, now, what were your expectations with regard to film criticism or film critique? What is the situation today? What are the differences? And maybe a second question that ties in with your response. So what would be the sustainable economy that can enable such a critique? Someone who sells ads, sells texts, and then also has to write 2 or 3 contributions for a catalog to be able to finance everything. What would be the kind of model that would get me out of this vicious circle, and would, for instance, get me into the funding of Neustadt Kultur? Can you hear me? Yes, of course. So, of course, these are very, very big questions, and it's very difficult to find a short answer to it. Now, with regard to expectations, I don't think, well, maybe some people really want to become a critic, an art critic. I personally didn't really aim to do that. I studied humanities, and I would have really preferred to also study many, many different other things. And I also took a long time studying at the time that was possible in the 1980s and the 1990s. And then, I loved writing, and so I started writing. Where can you do that? Of course, it's better if you don't just do it in your diary. Of course, it's always better if other people also read what you write, and you can do that where your texts are being published. And at the time, it was mainly newspapers. For the radio, you need technologies. Today, I mainly do radio, but, in contrast to the other people here on the panel, I can't really distinguish between my different identities and say I speak as such in such a situation. But, I would say that from my perspective, I did movies. I'm also a movie artist or a film artist. I'm also a cultural political functionary. I work for different film festivals, and that's what I represent there. But first and foremost, I'm someone who is interested in film and culture, so someone who professionally deals with culture, with art, and I would always claim to speak as an individual. And from what perspective perspective that actually comes, what other people then need to try and figure out. I don't really need to do that myself. And maybe you sometimes do that. You kind of give an additional explanation so that people understand the context. But critique, also in contrast to other kinds of journalism, which is why there are two different words for it, is something very personal, something very subjective. And the expectation that I had in the beginning was that, it kind of crystallized that critique or reviews, especially film criticism, is something where I can speak with my own voice and I can say something that is interesting for me, but also for other people. But the audience of critique, and let me now tell you a short anecdote from the beginnings. So I wrote as an independent journalist, but I did my first real internship at the German newspaper Frankfurter Rundschau for the local section, and they told me, "Oh, Mr. Suchsland, will the grandmother, from a small town and on the 6th floor understand what you wrote?" And so I had to, make it a little bit simpler. That was the cliche. And Thomas Asser was an editor at the Rundschau at the time, and I wrote something for him, and I told him that story, and he asked me, "Well, is it, for the grandmother in Bornheim on the 3rd floor?" "No, Mr. Suchsland, no. We're just writing for us, for ourselves." So maybe for this editing board, or maybe for critics and other newspapers who read it. And these are the different kind of perspective, and I can't really say which one I think is better. So you're always trying and do both. Sometimes you try and do more for that one side, and sometimes more for the other. Now, the second question, what was the second question? I already forgot. So what are forms of sustainable economy? But maybe, I would like to add something to the anecdote you mentioned, but what was the economic situation in both of these cases? Well, it was possible to earn earn a good money with that, especially if you studied at the time at the Rundschau in the 1990s. You could earn a little bit more for the local section. You could sometimes write 10 small texts that were used over the next few years, and that meant a lot of money. And if you had evening events, you did 2 or 3 in a row, then you charged lump sums of about 80 Deutsche Mark. So that, was really not bad. And of course, in the culture section, they liked my text, and so I received another lump sum for that, and worked kind of well. Of course, I had to write maybe 6 texts per month, and if it was a little bit more, then I would maybe also get a little bit more. And these lump sums are now, or these lump fees are now illegal. No, I think that it still exists. At least sometimes you hear that some people do charge lump sum still, and I think the Rundschau actually went bankrupt. Well, what would be sustainable? Well, 2 things. Maybe you don't have to pay fees, you have to pay working hours also for freelancers. That is a very important aspect. And on the other hand, what you create is, of course, also worth something, so it should also be paid. And that is another very important aspect. Of course, on radio, it's all in the Mediathek, in the media section. I do a lot more for the radio because they pay better, maybe also because I'm quite good at it. But, in the print media, there are so many archives that you can only access when you have an access key and you pay for it. And a lot of media houses have large archives that they sell. They also sell DVDs. You probably remember that 10 years ago that you were able to buy the whole archive of the Spiegel. Now it works a little bit differently. You buy access, and of course that means that my text is repeatedly being sold, but you don't receive any money for that. No, exactly. And one of the reasons for why I don't write for the FAZ anymore, and you like these kind of anecdotes, I know, and that is because of something that doesn't actually have anything to do with the FAZ, but I once published a text in which I wrote about the letters that you get from the publishing houses, and the FAZ, didn't write any of these letters to me at the time, and I had already worked for them for 7 or 8 years. But other publishing houses send you a letter, so agreement for freelancers, and that include a stipulation saying you waive the right for all and future media. And that, of course, means that it only means the rights of use, and then because otherwise you could sue them, and says that this doesn't pertain or this doesn't touch upon your copyright. But of course, that's wrong, because if I sold the text, for instance, to, well, could I just add something? Is it also possible for critics to become a member of VG Bildkunst, for instance? Well, both, yes. If you make films, then you also add VG Bildkunst, otherwise VG Wort. Of course, we're a member of it. Well, many would be, and of course you would be stupid if you weren't, because it's actually not a bad thing. But, of course, that doesn't really remedy the situation. There were authors which were taken over, before the digital age. They had contracts or agreements as authors, and all of a sudden that text appeared in online archives, and so these authors, I know an author from the Süddeutsche who sued the newspaper, and when you look for his name in the Süddeutsche archive, you can read that this text by XY is banned for further use. Of course, that's possible, but of course, he didn't continue writing for the SZ, but he didn't care. But we could talk about that for another whole hour. But isn't it sad that nothing is established in order to make sure that authors receive payment and for the text to still be available online? So the archive that I just mentioned is a closed archive, an archive that you need to pay for. And the public broadcasters, so Deutschlandfunk, for instance, of course, these archives can be publicly accessible. But, it's a bit at the margins of legality, and this right that I mentioned earlier, that is being defended by a lot of parties, is a very peculiar right. It's a right that kind of takes rights away from authors. Because otherwise, analogous to VG Wort, you would receive yearly payments for appearing in these archives. So maybe a proposal for the SZ, the FAZ, and all of the other newspapers that I can actually afford it. I would now like to show a slide of a document which Zoe Claire Miller shared with me today. And maybe, Zoe, you could give a brief introduction or kind of a re-evaluation of the work of critics. Maybe you could also recommend some minimum fees. Could you maybe scroll down a little bit? Oh, no, this is actually the next slide. Yeah, so these are the minimum fees, recommendations for minimum fees by the Cultural Senate. So thank you very much, Lilian Engelmann and Nora Gatewood, who sent me a few graphs at very short notice. So I can't really say much for the other segments, but for visual arts, for a long time, we at the BBK Berlin really fought for a long time that there are minimum fees, and we started it first for the commune, for the municipal galleries, because these are also, they receive public funding, and there are a lot of them, and a lot of artists exhibit there every year, and they have a very low budget, and so they can hardly, take something from their own budget in order to pay fees to the artists. And so we cooperated with them, with these municipal galleries, and tried to demand a fixed budget that is then integrated into the overall budget, and that is then used for these fees. And it is based on the number of exhibitions of the artists, and they have almost been doubled this year. And these are, of course, all minimum fees. So these are also fees that are only supposed to be paid for the fact that the artist owning this work makes this work available, and other forms of work should receive separate payment. But that has a great additional effect because of the fact that this fee recommendation is now integrated or included in all of the applications for funding. So when an institution get public funding, for instance, at the German state of Berlin, then they see this annex, and they know that they need to plan with that at the very least. Otherwise, they wouldn't receive any funding. And when it was introduced, we called all of the public institutions and we asked them, are you actually paying that? And they said, yes, of course. So it is a very, very useful tool, and also means to exert pressure that in Berlin, for the public institutions, there are certain minimum benchmark fees, and of course there are some problems or some weaknesses because if a multimillionaire says, okay, I do a fantastic exhibition, you're more than 30 artists, and we use 7,000 square meters, but that means 150 euro per artist, of course, then that wouldn't be adequate anymore. And so if you have very, very large events with a very big budget, you would still have to keep into consideration that these are minimum fees and not just exhibition fees, and they should be within a framework or at a level that is proportional to the overall budget. But we can also see that from other states and other municipalities, they use this model, and that fees are available from this kind of public fund that can be used for this kind of budget. And of course, it's also then this exists also for smaller segments such as comics, for instance, where you would think, well, they're probably not thousands and thousands of people who have to fight for their rights. So it's great that we have specialized recommendations for these kind of segments, but it would also be good to use it as an abstract model for art criticism. It doesn't, so maybe they don't, just this kind of idea that there are funds at a certain place and there are minimum fee standards that were established with representatives from these different segments, and this is decoupled from the print media where the situation is really fucked up, that are really almost about to go bankrupt because of social media and the internet. And so maybe that would be a possibility to make sure that there is independent criticism. So can I ask you a question? How many members are organized in this kind of way? Is there a critical size, or what critical size is needed for this to actually then be implemented? Well, at the BBK Berlin, I think we have about, 2,800 members, And I believe that the first round of the minimum fees in Berlin was introduced in 2013. So that kind of makes me think of another question. What about the relevant size for critics? So for music critics, it's a lot. There are a lot fewer, less than 100 or fewer than 100. So the question is, how can we receive this critical size or of a mass that can organize itself? Well, why don't you think you could apply it for music, for instance? Well, because of maybe ties or influence of other tasks or functions that we have. But the impression that I have is that for smaller scenes or smaller segments, the private interactions play a much bigger role. And it's I think it is much more interlinked, and is also due to how things were in the past. Now, from composing, for instance, would be exactly the same. There are a lot of mentor relationships, mentor-mentee relationships, and there isn't really the situation that you reach this kind of conflict line. So, but it's not really a conflict, right? There are not really any enemies. You just want to exert pressure on politics, right, for them to make funds available that can then be made available, and wouldn't then all critics from all kinds of forms of art organize themselves, and wouldn't they then not be supported by the media, the institutions, and the people creating art and culture? I think they would, because everyone wants that their work is being discussed and discussed well and or reviewed well. So I think yeah, absolutely. I agree. If it actually worked transversely or across boundaries, yes, absolutely. But I don't really see a lot of discussions in that direction. Now, what about AICA? Weren't they also at Monika Grütter's office at the beginning of the pandemic? Maybe a representative of the board of AICA during our open round can explain that. Well, I am a member of AICA and have been since 2019, so just before the pandemic. That's when I joined them. And the possibility to introduce these kind of proposals, the whole process is very slow. I'm not going to comment on that any further, but I believe that it's still important to try and figure out, well, why is this still not the case? And I also have to admit that I pay authors for their contributions for art of the working class. So every pitch is accepted and analyzed and processed, and those who want to go through this process, these texts are the ones that are being published at the end. And it's a lot of work from all sides, because it's not just the work that, in which we invest a lot of hours, but it's also a work that we kind of force, because a lot of people approach us and say, okay, write for Vogue or for Frieze or for other publications. And then I think, well, can I see the text first and foremost? And then what is it all about? Or, are we another token as arts of the working class for, an accumulation of symbolic value that doesn't mean anything from a social point of view for a lot of people, but only for the art scene?
Can I ask something about that? You say you discuss the texts. I already start getting a pulse as an author, because normally it would be good in good redactions that where a text is being taken up with its subjective voice. So if I would hand in a film critique somewhere and talk about and write about something that interests you as well, and then 5 other people talk about it, and then in the end even with me, and then I have to change it even. So no, it's not actually the whole team, but there's an editor that is working on one text. But interestingly, and this is maybe another start, this is maybe leading to another question before we open the big discussion round. So for the 5th time, we have been denied a funding application without any reasoning, where we tried to get figures like these. So at the moment, we pay 20 cents per word, and that is not very much, but it's only 5 cents less than The Guardian. But for a street magazine, this is then really good already. And the question that I actually wanted to ask, and this would help us all, what kind of lack are we talking about if we talk about lacking funding? So how can the lack of stable working conditions for critics be improved? Or how can we act upon that? Should I? Yeah. Okay. Well, so there is one model that is already being applied in some ways of public funding. So we do have public broadcasters. All of those have a great quality, and you can secure independence with that. But this independence is, of course, always under scrutiny, because we know those discussions. But also there are, on the other hand, those dynamics that are being developed there. So you have a works retirement payment program. I don't have to talk about Mr. Schlesinger. We know it all, but I think it's often quite difficult to talk about these things. So the basic principle is the public funding would be good, but has its own problems. So Artischock München is funded by the city of München. Well, we can dream about these fees there. Well, they don't get a lot of money there, and we are exploiting ourselves there, but we pay for most texts 40 euros lump sum. So it is not a lot, but it is more than in the internet, than you get in the internet. You said, thanks to social media and internet, the newspapers are almost insolvent, but it is not true. It is the newspapers who are putting all of their content on the internet without any charge. and this is their own fault. You can do a lot in the internet, but I think that we have to pay attention to one certain aspect, which is also a problem of the critic. So all of us, if you agree with me, critique is also art. We all do that from a passion, and so you tend to exploit yourself a lot more than, for example, if you work in a public institution and you exploit yourself, and you often do that voluntarily. And I don't want to be regulated by the state telling me I can't do this because this is my passion. So often those minimum fees aren't respected because some authors are even putting their texts on Facebook without any charge. So the newspaper can't earn any money anymore with that. Well, maybe we should start a group like Exploited Anonymous. Democratic Union, for example. We started this with Arts of the Working Class. We started the title Union des Refusés. You can read about this on our website as well. Well, your question was how can we get there, stable working conditions. I don't know, but it would be maybe an idea to start with the strategy of the Berlin minimum fees, but I can say why. I want that there is an independent critique, and I want that the critique feels free and has the time to do deep research, and these cultural research that were published with a perspective that is a no-brainer for everybody. Well, oh wow, a lot of money has been put in there, but you don't ask that. Well, galleries now that already have an income of millions can even get a funding of 170,000 euros on top, even if they didn't need it. And at the same time, some artists didn't have a high funding quota. So there was the funding for galleries. They had 80% yes votes, and the artists had a funding quota that was just as low. But at this point in time, many people should have said, right, something isn't going right here. We should maybe rethink about the funding, and this came from different artist groups. And from our side of BBK Berlin, we did 10 press publications and open letters from members, but this criticism was just, put aside, and the Bundeskultur, the Stiftung Kunstfonds, the Deutsche Kulturrat all ignored our criticism. I know that this is a personal staff problem, but it's also a structural problem. If we are trying to implement something for 2 years and it doesn't work, then, well, it is a problem. And nobody from the professional press did pick up on that. And what is the question between economic funding and cultural funding? How can we make that difference? How can we assess if those arguments are even true? And some people say the best funding for artists is the funding of galleries because everything is going to the artists. Well, that's not true, because it's only the market artists that already have a good income and are wealthy, and it's not those who have to get social security, and they don't get any of that funding. I have to make a call out now, because it is actually unbelievable who is in the Stiftung, in the board of the foundation. So it's mostly representatives of the artists. So Akademie der Künste, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Deutsche Kunstvereine, maybe they're neutral, of course. Bundesverband Deutsche Künstlerinnen und Künstler, they are also represented in the board of the Deutsche Kulturrat and the Deutsche Kunstrat within the Deutsche Kulturrat. Maybe. Well, but where's the criticism now? Internationales Künstlergremium, Verbände der Gemeinschaft für Kunstfördernde, VGB Kunst. The criticism could have actually noticed that something is going wrong and should have written something about that. And that's why I want better conditions within the critique, so that in the future things like that don't happen. So that those artists who have reported on that, like for example artists in a street art atelier in Gießen, have gotten 100,000 euros. Those are actually not from the profession, and they are journalists, so that it's not their actual task. Well, they do not have the perspective of this dependence that is normal in this field. So they should start criticizing that more. Well, I have to say something about that. The problem is with film. We have seen this in film as well. So the cinemas have gotten funding and not the videotheks and so on. But we have to ask ourselves who is criticism for, not only for the artists, but also for the audience, everybody who's actually interested in that. And this audience is very slow. You have to, you just talked about Cahiers du Cinéma, that's France, and the conditions there are very, very different in France than in Germany, like a country in Germany. Here in Germany, this doesn't actually exist. In the audience, there is a lot of passivity, a lot of slowness and ignorance also. You talked about this politics, where there were many different... Well, they were addressed, but nobody reacted. So they talked about everything also during COVID. Nobody really cared about the artists, even maybe only if they were old and in the hospital. Well, I only know very little people who are in the film business. I thought it would be different there, but I'm very much looking forward to learning about what kind of research is going to happen there, because those different projects should have been saved by Deutschlandfunk Kultur. And in France, it is horrible because it is great. It is unbelievable because there is even an insurance for being out of work, and if you are between projects, you can get money. Well, this exists here too. You have to go to the Arbeitsamt. Of course, you have to still. You always have to be registered with the Arbeitsamt and pay them when you work. But the Arbeitsamt is having problems to understand the film work, and because people work for, I don't know, a few months, then they're out of work, and then they work again, and then in theater it's even more different, and then they even change between the fields, and that is very hard to understand. Well, I wanted to get back on the question on the possibilities and opportunities for the future of criticism. Well, from the perspective of experimental music, it is those figures are absolutely utopic. You cannot get more than a few hundred euros you can earn from that per month. And I wanted to ask the question, or touch the question of, or the utopic idea of critique. So when we talk about all this discussion about the payment modalities, payment fairness, and where does the funding come from? So public funding to oppose the private funding, for example. I do not want to get into that, but I have the impression that the discussion is pointing at having way more publications and just have a sheer mass of things, and this is a problem. And I have a proposition here how to deal with that. So yesterday we talked about transversal critique and participating critics, and this also serves at connecting sites and connecting different channels and not just keep putting everything out there. And so, of course, this is not connected to the funding being reduced and so on. We shouldn't aim at that. But this is a small perspective here. It would be better to have more concise and communal approach to criticism. I think that's very hardly being able to. We cannot connect this with capitalism. Well, this is a critique of capitalism, and I want to introduce a new model here that I think is a good example for that, or a counter message to accumulation. And this is a proposal of CASE. CASE is a collective of Nicholas Tammins, Sung Chu, who is an artist, and Adam Harrison from the Studio for Propositional Cinema. And what they introduce is maybe also another idea for my attention for stable working conditions of criticism. This is this letter that Nicholas, Song, and Adam are proposing. So I'm going to read out aloud.
Gallerists, art workers. We have a proposal for how the economic model of group exhibitions could function, one that we hope could serve as a prototype for others going forward. It is generally accepted that group exhibitions and galleries operate on the economic premise that some artists are more likely to sell while others bring in other forms of value, be it symbolic or cultural in nature. We believe that this fact perpetuates established economic imbalances while ensuring that the undercompensation of certain forms of art while achieving the same nominal visibility in the exhibition context. As an effort to address this, we believe that as a temporary community of artists in an exhibition, all participating artists should partake in an exhibition's financial success. Therefore, we propose that 10% of all sales profits, in parentheses after production costs, in a group exhibition of 5% from the artist portion and 5% from the galleries, be split equally and redistributed among all participating artists. This way, we veer away from purely individualized accumulation towards promoting the collective value of a compensation through artist fees. With the growing privatization and stratification of the art world and an individualized outlook of success where winners and losers are clearly defined in financial terms, we believe that more collective-minded and conscious economic models must be proposed to intervene in the art systems, establish structural imbalances. I will leave it there and maybe engage with the audience. Back to the question posed at the beginning, what's the value of the critique? Are there any questions in the audience?
Dann würde ich vielleicht mit einer Frage einspringen.
Well, I would actually ask a question to Martin Schüttler, who hasn't had a lot of talking time here on this panel. Just as you said it before, the new and contemporary music is very much dependent on the question whether there is a critique on it. So, and you said that this does not really happen, but why does it exist then? So what does it live from the academies, from the festivals and the public broadcasting? Or could you maybe start from this position of a very programmatic, hard to grasp form of art? What could you elaborate on? What would what we would miss if the criticism wouldn't exist. So thank you very much for this question. I think it is mainly a form of art of presence. It is an art that takes up space. It doesn't produce many pictures. It doesn't produce any signs. Even the signs of sound are very little, not very easy to grasp. And so far, it is a very resisting kind of art, and its resistance consists of its stubbornness against this whole context of market economy. So also it's not dependent on the internal economies and also other things. But to come back to the question of criticism or critique, it is very hard. I think Leonie Reinicke said that in Bonn already, to find a verbalization or to any terms for this, but it would be actually necessary. But it would be necessary to find language to be able to talk about the contemporary music, the experimental music that doesn't reduce it to some kind of event, some kind of experience and spectacle, but to give it some space that actually was implied very much yesterday, namely listening as a practice of listening and the practice of not enjoyable listening. This is what makes people think and makes people readjust their hearing apparatus. So this is part of also a core of criticism. So that is why I had the idea of redefining music criticism in the sense of a musical critique, as an improvisation, like a jazz concert, as a noise concert where arguments are only possible if you have listened before or if you exchange them. This could have a very relevant voice if its structure and its whole form, it would be included more in the form of criticism or critique. So podcasts are very close to that because they're the medium. They can transfer their own medium. And finding a linguistic translation is part of the tasks of the music criticism. So if you find other strategies, other topics here, other approaches, then sites for that would also start existing. Well, I would like to comment on that. I think it's very right and very important what you just said, because especially this improvisation thought that you mentioned, that is something that goes for all of the art critiques. And it is always about promoting the audience. And if we talk about the media, then you would also see that there is also this kind of downsizing and the common basis. But what would criticism look like if we would also transfer it to other fields? And this is a question that we get back to always, and we have to not always talk about this contentism and politicizing of contents. You don't have to always start make Stand by Ukraine into an art, and this kind of message is not always does not always have to be transferred into art. And I want to connect this thought about your question from the beginning. There is this thought, and for many reasons, people from not bourgeois societal groups can not as easily become critics. So at the same time, we not only have to talk about inclusion, but also talk about criticism being an art, being elitary. And we live in a time where everything that is about the elites is being questioned, but we have to say that we have to start listening, and we have to maybe also open ourselves to something that is not easy, not enjoyable, and you can gain from that, but you have to believe the elitist critics here. Well, there is great ideas still also for anti-elitists criticism. So I'm thinking of the White Pew from England. They became known because they started with writing art criticism, and it is now a project that has many different platforms, and it has also they also tried to apply for funding a lot, and they wrote about art in a way that was very accessible, poppy, and fresh, you know, and it was not elitist. It was not thinking, and you don't have to read Hegel. Well, I didn't say that. You don't have to read Hegel, of course. I didn't say that you have to, but still, it would be good to read it. Well, the thing is that Aunt Lieschen can't do that because she works at Lidl, and I think that's elitist of you because, well, you didn't say that she's living in a mansion because, well, why don't you? How do you know what Aunt Lieschen can't do or can do? Well, many of the academics are saying that the lower class can't do stuff. I have studied too, and I cannot read Hegel, but I have read critics from other fields, and then thought, well, I'm going to watch this or I'm going to listen to this. I don't know anything about experimental music, for example, but sometimes critics can write about it so greatly that I, who is not from this field, am still interested. Well, sometimes, well, as a critic, a normal critic would write for everybody, so sometimes for Aunt Lieschen and sometimes for others. I think that making people do something or go under something, well, that is not elitist, it is humanist. So there is, for example, an aesthetic experience that people are confronted with, and that is not elitist at all. Well, let's open the round for the audience. Also, there are many people who want to say something. I think the first hand was raised was Gina Kaya. I think we need the microphone still for the translators. Well, I have the question that we're talking always about the form of writing and reading, and I was interested in, because you're from music, you came and from Bonn, we have heard many people, not that many people from the radio, but the format is very important. Well, for example, we have to be able to listen, but you have to have time and patience to read, and this is something that is already going down. It is a fact. We are having problems here, even with, especially with long text. And this shows the success of everything that is very fast. And this is something that I was pointing at. So how can criticism be conveyed in other spaces in a different way, maybe acoustic way, or well, not in the written way, at least, because I am from the writing field, and I see that less people are reading and writing. I do not see in the public space that people are sitting in trains and buses who are reading newspapers. I live in France, and in France, everybody reads a newspaper in public transport. And this is a problem that we have in Germany, therefore. And what kind of ways do you have with dealing with this problem.
So, of course, there are different acoustic spaces such as podcasts, but also other kinds of online formats. Then, of course, there are also the traditional radio shows and so on and so forth. But I would also, like people to integrate it into different events. Of course, today we're here, but yesterday we also had a concert by the Ensemble Mosaïque and their musical contribution, and breaking open this kind of dominion of the verbal sphere and opening up towards other kinds of formats of perception is extremely important and could bring us a lot further. And we were just talking about reading. I think it's very trivial and something that we all take for granted, that we all learn to read. But something that is a bit less trivial is that we learn how to listen, that we learn how to hear. And I come from a school of music where we have a subject that teaches people how to listen, but also based on a very canonical kind of format that I don't necessarily want to support. But just the idea that there is a necessity to learn how to hear and how to listen is extremely important. And now, critics for schools, would you like to add anything? I would just like to ask you a question. Do we actually agree on what needs to be protected? Because I have the impression, well, I come from this interim generation that used to grow up without mobile phones, but now uses mobile phones and started studying without computers. I would say that reading needs to be protected, especially the reading of more difficult texts. But when you talk with them, they actually say that they listen to the audiobooks when they drive to work. And I think it's a little bit sad. I have to admit that, Hegel as an audiobook isn't possible. Tolstoy as an audiobook is maybe possible. So that means that Hegel isn't actually read anymore at all. And I do think that it is a German problem. And I would really like to have support for the culture of reading. And so maybe, yes, maybe we should have some public funding for newspapers. And it was also a proposal of Klaus Steg. And I think, yes, we need to learn how to hear and how to listen, but it's also a kind of facilitated or simplified format of a lot of things. And I say that as someone who works for the radio and does podcasts. Are there any other questions from the audience? I am also a voice of the non-existent music critic, especially with regard to experimental criticism and critique. And I think that writing about listening and writing about hearing is how you learn how to hear and listen. And, and finding words for sound is where a lot of differentiation happens. And, that brings me to my next question. Well, that brings me to my question. And I'm sure that we don't all agree, but there are different positions here, but it's always difficult to find authors. I often get the feeling that there aren't that many people who know that they can write about a certain subject. And so a question for Ms. Plaza Lazo would be the following. How was it with or at Arts for the Working Class, especially in the beginnings? How did it work? How do you find the people that want to participate? Do you actually actively approach people? Does it just kind of happen? Through the speakers and especially through music, we were lucky enough to work with the magazine Positionen. That is a magazine for experimental music and sound. And we had different kinds of talks and conversations with them. But for every individual contribution, we make sure that, it can be any channel, any media can be done, or, on the street, Instagram, social media in general. If you want, you can also send me a text if you like. I'm sure that we will find the right framework for it. Can I add something? Well, you just mentioned Positionen, the magazine. I think there are some copies outside. That would be one music magazine or journal that is a good example for a magazine that writes about important topics for contemporary music. Now, I think it's absolutely correct that every person should or can and has to write about hearing and listening. And, that's exactly what I mean when I say that we need to learn how to listen and hear. And I don't mean that we kind of need a rule-based education based on a different canon. Maybe that's important if you work in academia, but this practice of having exchange about what you were listening to and what you were hearing and connecting that with written criticism is something that I think should be a lot more present, because currently I have the impression that people know what they like, and so that's the kind of things that they listen to, and then people just defend what they like. I think there's another question over there. Yes, there is a contradiction with what you say, Mr. Suchsland. You said in the beginning that critique tries to be objective, and then, thank God, later on you said that criticism or critique is subjective. Well, I think critique that says that it's objective is dead, no longer exists. I don't think it should be anymore, but I think it's important that critique is transparent, that it kind of discloses its criteria, But I believe that when we criticize things, we kind of compare it with different things, and an objective critique would put things on top of each other, and I don't think that we should do that. I think from an emotional point of view, we should meet at a certain level and criticize each other. So yes, pro-subjectivity, please. Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and if I mention the objectiveness in the beginning, that it's the kind of target, right, that someone to achieve, and Habermas and the unity of reason in its many voices. There are so many subjective voices of criticism, and they can maybe be a kind of objectiveness or objective nature. I'm a Hegelian myself, and so it's a whole dialectical process. It's nothing that stays the same, unmoving, but it's in a kind of tension field that keeps on moving. And if you put the pendulum too much on the one side, then on the other side, you need to also show the contradiction. And that's also what critique is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to question things. It's supposed to irritate majority opinions, and sometimes it's a little bit more than that, and it's supposed to question these kinds of majority opinions. And good critics can also have different positions or opinions with regard to film, for instance. That's the area that I know the best, and you can of course defend a film with very good arguments and also attack it with very good arguments, and what the result is not something that we need to call objective per se. Yeah, it's great what you say. I think unity and reason with the polyphony of voices, and as I mentioned earlier, it's about going to an exhibition or not going, hearing or listening or not listening. And for this polyphony of voices, of course, it's clear that we can't all listen at the same time. Habermas is basically relying on that, and I think from an anthropological point of view, I think it's justified. There is a unity of reason without us hearing all voices, but now we're talking about the voices. And that brings me to my question just in a bit. I just want to add one more comment with regard to the observations in Berlin's metro and S-Bahn. And you can see that everyone has some sort of device in their ear, meaning that they're listening to something all of the time. Even here, sitting on their seat, people have something in their ears. I don't know what they're listening to. I don't know if they're listening to music or audiobooks or whatever it may be, but you can't say that people don't hear with all of their senses. So a question for you as a musician: it's of course clear to me that there are different scenes, so the polyphony of voices, right? But now it's a bit of it's an educational task to make sure that others also hear me. But you can also, of course, say that you need to approach it. So an example that was very striking for me. For a long time, I've been admiring Rainer Goebbels' music. It's not really that modern, but Rainer Goebbels, because he was always wondering that no reviews were published about him, he once called it opera. He just used the word opera, 5 letters, and all of a sudden the room was full of critics. And the next time he didn't use the word opera because he doesn't actually have a good relationship to it internally. No one was there. No one came. So you have to realize that there are these kinds of world that you also need to reflect on. As I mentioned earlier, when I said that places are guilty or aren't not guilty, there are these kinds of reflexes, right? Visiting reflexes, critique reflexes, and a lot is in a way prescribed. Screenplays to a certain part are already kind of prescribed to us, where we're supposed to go and how we have to behave. But now one more thing on the ears, and I spoke about listening and not hearing, actually. So in individual cases, you can't really know that, but there is, of course, the hearing of a soundtrack, meaning that you make your life into a soundtrack through this musical accompaniment, which can be nice. And thank you very much to all of my guests today for this great panel discussion, and thank you very much to the audience. And yeah, I wish you a lot of energy for the next round of talks.